Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It was a typical morning, or at least it seemed so at first. The air was cool, and the sky was a pale shade of blue, like the beginning of any other day. I stood at the bus stop, my hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets, waiting for the bus that was always late. I wasn't in any hurry. I never really was. But today, something caught my eye. I had been glancing absent-mindedly at the usual stop signs, the scattered leaves, and the quiet streets when something different appeared on the edge of my vision. A clock. It was an old-fashioned, brass clock mounted to the lamppost at the far end of the bus stop. But this wasn't the usual timepiece. It was strange. There was no visible sign of when it had been put there, and its hands were moving in the wrong direction, backwards. My first thought was that it must be broken, but I knew that it wasn't. The clock's hands moved deliberately, slowly, as if time itself were unwinding. I stared at it for a moment, and then a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. I stepped closer, my curiosity overtaking any rational thought. The seconds seemed to stretch unnaturally as I approached it. The ticking was louder now, and the closer I got, the more distinct the sound became. It was as if the clock was trying to pull me in. I didn't know why, but my hand reached out toward it. Before I could touch the clock, a sudden and jarring silence filled the air. The traffic, the chatter of people nearby, even the distant hum of the city, it all stopped. The world around me paused, frozen in a moment of stillness. The clock, too, stopped moving. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick and heavy, like time itself had become trapped in this small fragment of reality. For a few seconds, everything was perfectly still. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. It was unsettling, suffocating even. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the stillness. Then, without warning, time started moving again. The hands of the clock resumed their backward motion. The world around me clicked back into place, the sound of traffic returning, and people resumed their walks, their conversations. The normalcy of it all made my heart race faster. I pulled my hand back, my mind reeling. Had that really happened? I looked around, but no one else seemed to have noticed. Everything was as it had been moments before, as if nothing had changed. But I knew it had. I could feel it. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure what. I turned away from the clock and glanced down the street, hoping the bus would arrive soon to take me away from this strange moment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had just happened, something that I wasn't ready to understand. The bus finally arrived, its tires screeching as it came to a halt. I stepped onto it without a second thought, my mind still trapped in that moment by the clock. What had I just witnessed? And more importantly, what had that moment done to me? The doors closed behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time wasn't quite as it seemed anymore. The ride to work was uneventful, but my mind couldn't settle. The image of the clock, its hands turning backward, kept flashing in front of my eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about how it had felt when time froze. I could almost still feel the weight of it, the thick silence pressing down on me. And the most disturbing part? I wasn't sure if it had been real. I tried to push the thought out of my head. I had to focus on the present, on the mundane things that made up my day. The usual chatter of passengers around me, the click of the bus doors, the hum of the engine, anything to distract me. But the harder I tried, the more the memory of that clock crept back into my thoughts. When I finally arrived at work, I noticed a strange unease lingering in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the weirdness of what had happened at the bus stop, it was something more. A nagging feeling that something wasn't right, something that had shifted in the world, or maybe within me. The air felt too still, like everything around me was holding its breath. I tried to focus on my tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a subtle sensation, not something overt, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. Whenever I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. Just the sterile office, the hum of computers, the faint sound of people typing. But the sense of being observed remained. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, as I was wrapping up my work, that I saw something that made my stomach turn. A small note was left on my desk. There was no signature, no return address, just a single, ominous line written in shaky handwriting, "You shouldn't have touched it." My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the words. Who had left this? How did they know? My mind raced. The note felt like a warning, a confirmation of the strange events earlier that morning. But who would know about the clock? I hadn't told anyone about it. I looked around the office, my eyes darting nervously over the desks of my coworkers, but no one seemed to pay me any attention. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger now, and my fingers trembled as I crumpled the note in my hand. I stood up abruptly, trying to shake the feeling of panic creeping in. I needed to leave. I had to get away from this, from whatever had started when I touched that clock. As I made my way to the exit, my mind kept returning to that strange, freezing moment. What had happened? And what did it mean? I didn't know, but I was sure of one thing. I couldn't go back. I couldn't go anywhere near that bus stop again. The door to the office clicked shut behind me, but the unease didn't fade. In fact, it only intensified. I walked to the bus stop in a daze, trying to keep my thoughts focused. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. When I reached the bus stop, my eyes instinctively darted toward the lamppost. The clock was still there, its hands now spinning in the opposite direction, backwards, faster than before. I took a step back, a cold shiver running down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from it. The clock seemed to pull at me, as if it were calling me back. Just as I began to step closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing at the other end of the bus stop, half hidden in the shadow. At first, I thought it was just a person waiting for the bus, but there was something wrong. The figure wasn't moving. It stood completely still, its head slightly tilted as if observing me. I squinted, my heart pounding. The figure's face was partially obscured, but I could see enough to recognize the outline of a familiar, yet unfamiliar, face. The face from the photo on my desk. The one that had been in the background. The blood drained from my face. It couldn't be. But it was. The person in the photo had somehow made their way here, to this very bus stop. I took a step back, my breath quickening. What was going on? How could this be happening? The figure didn't move. It just stared, unmoving, as if waiting for something. For me to make a move? To do something? I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. I turned quickly, walking away from the bus stop as fast as I could, my heart racing with every step. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching me, that it was following me. I looked over my shoulder once more, and for a brief moment, I swore I saw it move, just a shift in the shadows. A step closer. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside my apartment. The door slammed shut behind me, and I leaned against it, gasping for breath. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. How could that person be at the bus stop? The one from the photo? It didn't make sense. I had only seen that face in a family photo. A photo from years ago. So why was it here now, in the flesh? I stumbled into the living room, my legs weak beneath me. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number of my best friend, Rachel. She'd always been the level-headed one, the one who could talk me through anything. The phone rang several times before she picked up. "Hello," she answered, her voice groggy. "Rachel, it's me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something's happening, and I don't know what to do." "Calm down, okay?" she said. "What's going on?" I saw someone today. At the bus stop. A man. But it was the same man from the photo. The one in the background of the family photo I showed you last week. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Wait, what? What do you mean, the man from the photo? Are you sure it was him?" "I'm not sure," I replied, my words tumbling out in a rush. But it looked exactly like him. The face. The same expression. And he was just standing there, watching me. I don't know what's going on, Rachel. It's like he was waiting for me. "Okay, listen," she said, her voice firm now. "You're probably just freaking yourself out. Maybe it's someone who looks like the guy from the photo. But why don't you come over here? We'll talk about it. Just get some rest, and we'll figure it out tomorrow." "I don't know." I hesitated. My pulse was still pounding in my throat. My body was shaking with the aftershock of what I had seen. "Don't overthink it. Just come here. You're safe, all right?" I hung up without another word. Her voice had done little to calm me, but I knew I couldn't stay here, alone. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls pressing in closer with every passing second. I grabbed my jacket and keys, nearly tripping over the floor as I hurried out the door. The street outside was quieter than usual, a deep fog settling in around the buildings. The light from the street lamps cast an eerie glow on the wet pavement. It was the kind of night where every shadow seemed to hold something, waiting, watching. I hugged my jacket tighter around me and tried not to let my thoughts spiral. I was almost to Rachel's apartment when something caught my eye. A flicker of movement from the corner of my vision. I stopped in my tracks, my heart suddenly racing again. There, in the fog, I could see the outline of a figure. It wasn't someone walking. It was still, motionless, just standing on the sidewalk, as though waiting. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure shifted slightly, and I saw a glimpse of a face. It was him. The man from the photo. My blood ran cold. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn and flee, but I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place, as though my body had betrayed me. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and suffocating. I knew it was him. It had to be. I backed away slowly, step by step, not daring to look away. The figure didn't follow me, but I could feel its presence looming behind me. Like it was tethered to me, somehow. Watching me. I finally turned and sprinted the rest of the way to Rachel's apartment, heart hammering in my chest. When I arrived, I practically threw open the door and stumbled inside. Rachel was already waiting for me in the living room, looking concerned. "What happened?" she asked, standing up quickly. "Are you all right?" "I saw him again," I gasped, still struggling to catch my breath. "He was out there, in the fog. Just standing there, watching me. I don't know what to do, Rachel. He's following me." Okay. Let's just calm down for a second," she said, guiding me to the couch. "You're safe here. No one's going to get you." But even as she spoke, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The fear, the unease, it was only getting worse. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was useless. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, standing in the fog, staring at me. And then, as though on cue, my phone buzzed on the table. I grabbed it with trembling hands. A new message. From an unknown number. It read, "I'm closer than you think." The air in the room went cold, and my blood froze in my veins. I didn't know who it was. I didn't know how, but I knew. He was here. And he was getting closer. I felt the walls closing around me as the words on my phone screen stared back at me. I couldn't look away. "I'm closer than you think." I read it over and over, but each time it felt more real, more sinister. The room seemed to grow colder, and I wrapped my arms around myself in an attempt to ward off the chill. Rachel must have seen the terror on my face because she immediately grabbed the phone from my hands. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaking. "But it's him. It's the man from the photo. He's getting closer, Rachel. I can feel it." Rachel looked at the phone for a moment, but then her face hardened with resolve. "Okay, we need to think this through. Let's try calling the number back." "No," I said quickly. "I don't want to. I just want to make this stop." But it was too late. My mind was spinning. The words were still echoing in my ears. "I'm closer than you think." I couldn't escape them. I stared out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing there again, watching me from the shadows. But the street outside was empty. There was no fog, no movement. The world looked normal. And yet, I knew better. The feeling in the pit of my stomach told me this was only the calm before the storm. Rachel put a hand on my shoulder. "We need to figure out what's going on. Maybe we should go back to the bus stop. Look for answers." I turned to her, wide-eyed. "Are you crazy? He's been there every time I've gone. He's waiting for me." "I know. But maybe we're missing something. Maybe there's something we're not seeing," she said, her voice trying to stay steady, though I could hear the fear hiding beneath it. I stood up, pacing the room. The idea of going back to the bus stop terrified me. But staying here, locked in this room with the unknown closing in, was worse. "You're right," I said, finally. "We need to figure this out. But I don't think we're safe here either." "Then we'll go together," she insisted. "We'll stick together, and we'll figure out what this is. My head was spinning, but I nodded. At least I wouldn't be alone. We left the apartment in silence, both of us aware of the danger of lurking around us. The streets were eerily quiet. No one else seemed to be out. It was almost as if the world had paused, just like time had the moment I touched that clock. When we arrived at the bus stop, the air was thick with tension. The same old clock stood there, unchanged, its hands still ticking backward. I felt my heart drop. There was no way I could touch it again. I couldn't risk it. Rachel stepped closer, inspecting the area, while I kept a distance, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. My mind kept replaying the figure in the fog, the way he stood there, staring at me with that cold, unblinking gaze. "Nothing here," Rachel said, shaking her head. "It's just an old bus stop." I didn't believe her. I couldn't. It wasn't just an old bus stop. It was the epicenter of whatever nightmare was unfolding. And then, as if to prove me wrong, I heard it. A soft noise, almost imperceptible at first. A scraping sound. I turned my head sharply, trying to pinpoint where it came from. It was close, too close. And then I saw it. The figure. He was standing at the edge of the street, half hidden in the shadows. His face was obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me. He was so still, so motionless, that I almost convinced myself he wasn't real. But the feeling in my chest, the coldness creeping up my spine, told me everything I needed to know. He was real, and he was here. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He hadn't moved. But the presence of him, the weight of it, felt suffocating. I glanced at Rachel, who was still inspecting the bus stop, oblivious to the danger right behind her. I had to warn her. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, a voice, low and gravelly, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but the figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the night, leaving only the echo of his voice behind. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse racing with fear. He was right there, I gasped. He was standing right there, Rachel. Rachel turned toward me, a confused look on her face. Who was? The man. The one from the photo, I said, panic rising in my voice. He was here. I saw him. But when I looked back, the street was empty. The shadows had swallowed him whole, and there was no trace of him left. Not even the slightest sign that he had been there at all. I felt sick to my stomach. "We need to go," I said, grabbing her arm. "Now." We didn't wait another second. We turned and ran. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back in the safety of Rachel's apartment. I closed the door behind us, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the feeling of his presence. My mind was spinning. What was happening? Who was that man? And why couldn't I escape him? Rachel sat down on the couch, her face pale. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But I don't think we're safe anymore. I think he's coming for me." And just like that, the phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't have to look at the screen to know it was from him. I'm already inside. The air in the room turned icy cold, and the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, as if it too was holding its breath. There was no escaping him now. The phone vibrated in my hand, the message lingering on the screen, burning into my vision. I'm already inside. The words felt like a physical blow, and my heart skipped a beat. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to get out, but my legs refused to move. It was as if I was paralyzed by the terror seeping through the very walls of the apartment. Rachel stood up, her face pale. What does that mean? Inside where? I don't know, I stammered, barely able to form the words. But he's here, Rachel. He's been here the whole time. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the air thick with tension. I could hear the faint tick of the clock on the wall, its steady rhythm now an ominous presence in the silence. The seconds felt stretched, endless, each one heavier than the last. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. We both froze, our breath caught in our throats. The knock was slow, deliberate, like someone testing to see if we were inside, waiting for a response. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes glued to the door. Who could that be? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Rachel shook her head, backing away. Don't open it. Just don't. The knocking continued, the sound growing louder, more insistent. Each thud against the door made my heart race faster. I could feel the cold sweat forming on my skin, my hands trembling. The presence outside, that man, was so close now, it felt like he was right on the other side, waiting to step in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I had to fight the urge to look through the peephole. What if it was him, standing there, waiting to make his move? What if he was already inside, watching us, just waiting for us to make a mistake? I glanced at Rachel, who was standing across the room, eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. We both knew what was coming. The feeling in the room, the suffocating weight of it, told us everything. The phone buzzed again, shattering the silence. This time, the message was different. You can't escape. Time is mine. I read the words aloud, my voice trembling. Time is mine. What does that even mean? Rachel didn't answer. She was staring at something behind me, her face going white. Her lips parted in a gasp, but no sound came out. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach as I looked toward the kitchen. The shadow in the doorway was unmistakable. It was him. The man from the photo, standing in the hallway, his figure barely visible in the dim light. His face was still obscured, but his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. You. I started, my voice barely a whisper. You're the one from the photo. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I could feel the temperature in the room drop even further, the cold creeping into my bones. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if time had frozen, and I was trapped in a moment I couldn't escape. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere far away, he spoke. You shouldn't have touched it. Now you belong to me. The words seemed to echo through the apartment, wrapping around me like a suffocating coil. I wanted to scream, to fight, but all I could do was stand there, frozen in place. Rachel took a hesitant step forward, her voice shaking. Who are you? What do you want from us? The man's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I am time, the keeper of it, the one who controls it. And you, You made a mistake. Now you will pay for it. I couldn't comprehend what he was saying. Time? The keeper of time? What did that even mean? But in my gut, I felt the truth of it. The clock, the way time had been warping around us, the way the world felt like it was slipping through my fingers. This man, this thing, wasn't human. He was something else. You touched the clock, he continued, his voice low and cold. And now, your fate is sealed. I felt my legs give out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. The room spun, and I could barely focus on what was happening around me. My mind was reeling. How had this all happened? How had something so ordinary, a clock, become the key to this nightmare? Suddenly, the man stepped closer, his figure becoming clearer. I could see his face now, though it was twisted, like a shadow stretching unnaturally. His features were sharp, too sharp, as if they had been carved into place. His eyes, those hollow eyes, seemed to see straight through me. Before I could react, I felt something strange. The air around us seemed to ripple, the world distorting, bending. I could hear the clock ticking, but it sounded wrong. It was too fast, then too slow, and then everything stopped. The room froze. The sounds disappeared. The air became thick, almost solid. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Time itself had stopped. The man was still standing there, but he no longer seemed like a person. He was an embodiment of time itself, something ancient, powerful, and terrifying. And then, in the silence, I realized something horrifying. We were no longer in control. Time had become the enemy. The silence was heavy, unnaturally heavy. At first, it was just a feeling, a small unease creeping along the edges of my mind. I stood in the doorway of the room, staring at the empty space ahead. The air was still, and yet, there was something about it that made me feel like I wasn't alone. It was the silence that felt wrong. I glanced back over my shoulder, but the hallway behind me was just as silent, just as empty. The house had always been quiet, but today it felt different. There was something about the way the air pressed against my skin that made my breath come a little quicker. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The room seemed ordinary, nothing about it stood out. Old furniture, a chair in the corner with a blanket draped over it, and a small lamp on a wooden table. But the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The air felt thick, and I could hear the faintest sound, a whisper. It was faint at first, like a trick of the mind. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was settling, or perhaps I was just tired. But then it came again, a soft murmur, barely audible. A voice. I froze. It wasn't my own voice, and it definitely wasn't anyone else in the house. I strained my ears to listen. The voice was unintelligible, like a distant conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be standing in the corner, watching me. But the room was still empty. The whispering grew louder. It was like the air itself was filled with voices, just out of reach, like a radio tuned to the wrong frequency. I felt my palms start to sweat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned to leave, my instinct screaming at me to get out of that room. But just as I reached the door, the voices stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the whispering itself. I stood frozen in the doorway, listening intently. Nothing. I stepped back into the room, my feet moving against my will. The door clicked shut behind me, trapping me inside. The floor creaked again, and I froze once more. There was a shift in the air, a coldness I hadn't noticed before. It was as if the room itself was aware of my presence, like I didn't belong. I tried to shake off the feeling, but my mind kept going back to the whispers. What were they? Why could I hear them? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden crash, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the room, though there was nothing there that could have caused it. My breath quickened, and I spun around, searching for the source of the noise. But there was nothing. No broken glass, no toppled furniture, just the same empty room. I was sure I hadn't imagined it, but now the silence felt suffocating. The whispering returned, louder now, more distinct. I could almost make out words, though they still eluded me. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to leave. I turned to the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. My hand shook as I twisted the handle, but it was stuck. My heart raced as panic set in. I pulled harder, my breath shallow and quick. But the door remained closed. The whispers were now a cacophony, swirling around me, getting louder with every passing second. I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me, suffocating me. My mind screamed to get out, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped. It wasn't until I felt something brush against my arm that I snapped back to reality. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the room. Just the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the room with me now. Something, watching. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. A voice. Clear and unmistakable. It was as if the whispering had formed into words. Don't leave. The voice was low, almost a breath against my ear. I recoiled, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone, and I couldn't escape. I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the silence and the oppressive weight of being watched. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The air felt thick, as though it were pressing against my chest, suffocating me. My vision blurred, and I felt dizzy. The room seemed to spin, as if the walls were closing in. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The air cleared, and I was left standing in the dead silence of the room. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to think. Was it all in my head? Was the house just old, creaky, full of strange noises? Or had I really heard something? I turned to leave again, but this time the door opened easily. I stepped out of the room, the cold air rushing over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something that hadn't left. I glanced back at the room, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the floor. But when I looked again, it was gone. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. It was nothing. It had to be. But as I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder, was I truly alone? Something told me I wasn't. The feeling didn't leave me. It followed me like a shadow, always lingering at the edges of my awareness. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the window, everything felt wrong. The house, which had once been a place of comfort, now seemed to be closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was there, just out of sight. I tried to distract myself, but every noise, every small movement made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about the whispers, the voice that had told me not to leave. It wasn't my imagination. It couldn't have been. Days passed in a haze of unease. I spent more time in the other rooms of the house, avoiding that one where the whispers had first started. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that the house was holding me captive. Then, one evening, I found something. It was hidden in a drawer, tucked beneath some old paperwork. A small, dusty device. It looked like an old-fashioned voice recorder, one of those that ran on cassette tapes. I had no idea why it was there, or what it had been used for. But something about it called to me, a strange pull that I couldn't resist. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, its buttons worn from years of use. There was a tape inside, still in place. My curiosity won over my fear, and I pressed the play button. At first, all I heard was static. But then, there was something else, a faint whisper, like the crackling of a distant conversation. I held the recorder closer to my ear, straining to hear. The voice was faint, indistinct, but unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard in the room. Don't leave, stay. The words sent a chill down my spine. I pulled the recorder away from my ear, my hand trembling. I could barely breathe. This wasn't possible. I had heard that voice in the room, hadn't I? And now it was coming from the recorder? I rewound the tape and played it again, listening more carefully. The whispers grew louder, clearer, like they were being directed at me. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have. Stay. It was as if the voice was taunting me, playing with my mind. My hand shook as I hit the stop button. I stared at the recorder, my thoughts a chaotic mess. How could this be? How could it know? I tried to reason with myself. Maybe the recorder had been left here by someone else, long before I moved in. Maybe the tape had been recorded years ago. But deep down, I knew the truth. The voice wasn't from the past, it was from now. And it was still here, still following me. I turned the recorder over, searching for a brand name or any indication of where it had come from, but there was nothing. Just an empty space, as if it had been wiped clean. The lack of any trace made my unease grow. It was then that I noticed something strange. A small button on the side of the device, one I hadn't seen before. I pressed it without thinking, and to my horror, the recorder began to play again. But this time, it wasn't the voice. It was the sounds of the room. My room. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards, the faint rustle of fabric, the soft click of the door as I had entered. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. There were sounds that shouldn't have been there, sounds that I hadn't heard while I was in the room. A faint, low murmur just beneath the static. Stay with us. I slammed the recorder shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The device had somehow recorded the sounds of the room even when I hadn't been there. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the room that was whispering to me, it was something else, something that had been there long before I arrived. Something that was watching, waiting, and calling out to me. I was trapped. I backed away from the recorder, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in this house any longer. I had to leave. But the thought of the whispers, of that voice, kept me rooted to the spot. The door that I had once thought was my escape now seemed like a trap, a way to draw me back in. The room, the house, wanted me to stay. But I knew I couldn't. I had to leave before whatever it was, whatever had been following me, trapped me for good. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, a cold wind blew through the room, slamming it shut with a force that made me jump. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The whispering was back, louder than ever, echoing in my mind. It was everywhere now, around me, through me, beneath my skin. Stay, stay with us. And then, I heard it again. The voice, clearer now, closer. It was right behind me, like a breath on the back of my neck. You can't leave. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty, silent room. I was no longer alone. The room seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, louder than the whispers, but the voice, that voice, was still there, imprinted in my mind, speaking to me, taunting me. You can't leave, it had said. The words felt like a chain, wrapping around my chest, tightening with every breath. I couldn't move. My legs refused to cooperate, frozen in place as if the room itself had a hold on me. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an unseen pressure. It was suffocating. I reached for the door again, but this time my hand trembled as I touched the handle. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what lay beyond it or of what was inside. I wasn't alone here, and I could feel it. It was in the air, in the walls, in the silence that filled every inch of the room. I pulled on the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was like it had fused with the frame, as though the house itself was refusing to let me out. My breath came quicker, and my chest tightened. Panic rose, clawing at my throat. I turned back to the recorder, which I had carelessly dropped onto the floor. The device lay there, quiet for now, but I knew it held the key to everything, if only I could figure out what it meant. I knelt down, reaching for it with shaking hands. The whispers started again, louder now, louder than ever before. I felt like they were pressing in on me, surrounding me, suffocating me. I didn't even want to press play again, but I knew I had no choice. The answers I was seeking were trapped inside this old machine, buried in the sounds it held. I pressed the play button. The static filled the room first, a low hum that seemed to vibrate beneath my skin. Then, once again, the whispers came, softer at first, almost like a lullaby. Stay, stay with us. But then the voice changed. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was deeper, more guttural, like something was struggling to get through the cracks of the static. Don't try to leave. You belong here now. I froze, the cold fingers of terror gripping me tighter. It wasn't just a warning. It was a command. Something was reaching out to me, something that wanted to pull me into the darkness. The voice, it wasn't human anymore. It wasn't even a voice, it was a presence. A force that wanted me to stay, to be a part of it. The recorder's volume increased on its own, and the sound became unbearable. I yanked the device away from my ear, but it kept playing, the voice growing louder and more insistent. You'll never leave, stay with us. My head spun. The words were too clear, too real. This wasn't just a recording. It wasn't just some trick of the machine. It was alive, a part of the house, part of me now. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the temperature drop, the chill seeping into my bones. The shadows in the room stretched, as if they were reaching out, pulling at my very soul. I could almost see them, flickering at the edges of my vision, dark, shifting forms that weren't quite human, but not entirely inhuman either. Figures that hovered in the corners, just beyond my reach. I could hear the sound of footsteps now, slow and deliberate, though there was no one else in the room. I turned, heart hammering, but there was nothing there, nothing but the darkness and the whispers. The whispers became a chorus, rising and falling in strange harmonies, as if they were calling to something, someone else. A presence, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me to step closer, to embrace the inevitable. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to escape. I had to break free. But as I turned to try the door again, I felt a presence behind me, a force so cold that it made my skin crawl. Before I could even turn around, a voice, not from the recorder but from somewhere deep within the room itself, whispered, too clear, too close. "You're not leaving." I whipped around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the cold, suffocating room. The walls began to pulse, vibrating with the sound of voices, hundreds of them, thousands, all speaking at once. The whispers were now a cacophony, overlapping and indistinguishable, rising higher and higher, drowning out my thoughts. I couldn't escape. There was no escape. The room was alive with them, whatever they were. And I was trapped. Suddenly, the recorder stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and in the dead quiet, I heard it, the faintest sound, like something scraping against the walls. Something moving. It was getting closer. The shadows in the room flickered again, and I thought I saw them move. They were alive. They were reaching for me, their forms twisting, crawling toward me. I could hear their whispers now, distinct and clear, as though they were speaking directly to me, in the same breath, in the same voice. "You belong with us now." I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. The coldness in the room was unbearable now, the weight of their presence pressing in on me. I had to get out. I had to run. But just as I tried to turn to the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. I screamed, my hands pulling at the handle, but it was stuck, frozen in place. The whispers became louder, the voices growing desperate. They were closing in on me. And then, I heard something even more chilling. A slow, deliberate footstep behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. I could feel it, the presence that had been watching me all along, the thing that had been waiting for me. "You can't leave." I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I knew I was no longer alone. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The hand on my shoulder was cold, like ice, yet it sent a shockwave of heat through my veins. It wasn't just a touch, it was a presence, an unrelenting force that anchored me in place. Every instinct screamed at me to break free, to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. The whispering, no longer soft and distant, now filled the room with a deafening intensity. Voices overlapping, urgent, pleading. They were all around me, suffocating me, weaving their words into the fabric of my thoughts. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were demands. "Stay with us. You are ours now." I turned slowly, though I didn't want to. My body moved against my will, as if something else was controlling me. The shadows in the room shifted with terrifying fluidity, coiling and writhing, drawing closer to me. I could see them more clearly now, forms that were not entirely human, but not quite monstrous either. They were something else. They were ancient, like a forgotten memory clawing its way back into existence. The hand that had touched me withdrew, and in its place, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that twisted unnaturally. The face, if it could even be called a face, was featureless, save for two glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness and into my very soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that screamed in unison, drowning out everything else. Don't fight it. You will stay. The figure took a step toward me, and with every movement, the air grew colder. I could feel the temperature plummeting, my breath visible in front of me, like I had stepped into an ice storm. The room seemed to stretch and twist, warping around me as if the very space I stood in was being reshaped. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. My mind was unraveling, the walls of reality blurring and bending. The shadows were closing in, pulling me toward them, and I couldn't fight it anymore. But then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't die here. I couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, take me. My hands trembled as I reached for the recorder that was still in my grip, a lifeline in the chaos. The whispers screamed louder, more insistent now, their words like daggers in my mind. But I couldn't stop. I pressed the record button. For a moment, nothing happened. The device seemed to hum as though it were awakening from a long slumber. Then, slowly, the voices faded. Not entirely, but enough to give me a brief moment of clarity. I could hear the soft click of the cassette inside, the same faint rustling that had been there before. The presence, the figure, paused for a moment as though confused. It was watching me closely now, its glowing eyes fixed on the recorder. A strange stillness filled the room, an odd, tense silence that made my heart race in anticipation. And then, something shifted. The recorder began to play. At first, it was nothing more than static, a low hum in the air. But then, I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. A voice I hadn't heard before. You can't escape. The figure flinched. It was a brief movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. For the first time, it seemed unsure. It took a step back, as though the voice in the recorder was forcing it to retreat. I pressed the button again, rewinding the tape. The whispers grew louder. I could hear them, my voice, my own voice, echoing through the device. I can't leave. I am already here. I hadn't recorded that. It wasn't me. But it was as though the recorder was speaking for me now, pulling me into the space between the whispers and the shadows, into something beyond. The figure recoiled, its eyes narrowing, its form twitching with agitation. It was losing control. The room began to shake, the walls warping and bending as if they were alive, trying to suffocate me, trying to drag me into the darkness. The cold pressed in, squeezing my chest. I held the recorder tight, gripping it with both hands, as the figure loomed closer again, its form stretching unnaturally tall. But now, I wasn't afraid. Not entirely. My fear had turned to a strange, burning resolve. This wasn't the end. I wasn't going to let it be. As I pressed the button again, the whispers became clearer. They were no longer distant or haunting. They were real. The figure seemed to flicker, as though it were losing its grip on reality. You're ours. I screamed into the void, into the recorder. No. And just like that, the air cracked. A sharp, deafening sound filled the room, like glass shattering. The walls shook, and the darkness receded. For a split second, everything was silent, everything was still. The figure vanished. The shadows retreated. The temperature returned to normal, and I was left standing alone in the middle of the room. My chest heaved as I looked around, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I was free. But was I? The recorder fell from my hands and landed with a soft thud on the floor. It had stopped playing. The whispers were gone, but the room still felt different. Empty. As though something essential had been taken away. I stepped back, my feet unsteady, and without a second thought, I ran for the door. This time, when I grabbed the handle, it opened. The sunlight that poured in felt like a miracle. But as I stepped out into the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. Watching me. I glanced back at the house one last time, the air still and heavy, but nothing moved. Yet in the deepest part of my mind, I could still hear it. The whispers. Waiting. I wasn't alone. Days passed since I left the house, but no matter how far I went, I could still feel its pull, its cold, suffocating presence. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling lingered. At night, I woke in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my mind racing through thoughts of that place. It was as though the house had left its mark on me, and no matter how hard I tried to outrun it, it was always there, waiting. I tried to resume my normal life, going to work, meeting friends, pretending everything was fine. But I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, followed. I'd turn around on the street, thinking I saw someone familiar, but it was always just a trick of the light or a fleeting shadow. But every time, my heart would skip and my mind would race. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived. There was no return address, only my name scrawled on the front in uneven handwriting. My hands shook as I tore open the packaging, and there, nestled inside, was the recorder. The one I had left behind in the house. It was exactly the same. Old, dusty, and somehow still pulsing with that strange energy. I froze, staring at the device. How had it gotten here? How had it found me? I didn't want to press play. I didn't want to hear those voices again, to feel the suffocating weight of the house bearing down on me. But I knew I had no choice. The recorder was here for a reason. The whispers weren't done with me. They never would be. With trembling hands, I pressed the play button. For a moment, nothing. Just static. My heart pounded as I waited, as the static stretched on, louder and louder. Then, a voice, low and echoing, broke through the noise. You thought you escaped. I pulled the recorder away from my ear, but the voice continued. It was coming from everywhere, swirling around me, like a phantom that refused to leave. You cannot escape. You belong to us now. I dropped the recorder in shock, watching as it fell to the floor with a soft thud. The voice had changed. It wasn't the same voice I had heard in the house. This was something different, something worse. It was everywhere, reverberating in my mind, growing louder. Suddenly, I heard it, soft at first, like the distant murmur of a conversation. The faintest scraping sound, just on the edge of my hearing. I turned toward the door, my body frozen with fear. I knew what was coming. Slowly, the door to my apartment creaked open, just a crack. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air in the room felt thick, stifling. My chest tightened as the scraping sound grew louder, coming from the other side of the door. And then, it stopped. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against me, heavier than anything I had ever felt. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in around me. And then, without warning, the door swung open wide. There was no one there. But the shadows in the room shifted. They moved, stretching across the walls like living things, curling around the corners of the room. I could see them, barely, dark shapes flickering in the edges of my vision, sliding from one spot to another. The whispers returned, louder now, swarming around me. "You belong with us." My heart raced as I stumbled backward, my body finally reacting to the overwhelming terror. But as I backed away, I realized something. The shadows, the voices, they weren't just in the room. They were in my mind, in my very being. They had never left me. I had never really escaped. I had only been running from myself. The recorder, it wasn't just a device. It was a bridge. A link between me and whatever it was that haunted that house. It wasn't just the house that had called me. It was something deeper, something older, something that had been there all along. And now, it had followed me. It wasn't just a part of the house anymore. It was part of me. And then, I understood. There was no escaping. The figure in the house, the whispers, the shadows, they weren't bound to that place. They were bound to me, to my mind, to my fear. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. The air grew cold, too cold to breathe. I could feel the presence again, the force that had been waiting, watching, stalking me all this time. The whispers came closer, their voices now a symphony of distorted, twisted sound, too many to count, too many to ignore. "You thought you could leave." I reached for the recorder one last time, desperate to end it, desperate to make it stop. But it wasn't in my hands anymore. I looked down in horror. It had never been there. I was already too far gone. And as the room closed in around me, I understood the final, terrible truth. I wasn't just trapped in the house anymore. I was trapped in my own mind. And the whispers would never stop. Have you ever wondered what your reflection is doing when you're not looking? Does it stay still, or does it move on its own, quietly mocking you when you turn your back? I never believed in such things, at least not until I moved into this house. Now, I can't look at a mirror the same way. It all started one evening, not long after I had moved into the old house on Elm Street. I had found the place online, cheap, roomy, with a vintage charm that I thought would suit me perfectly. The bathrooms were cramped, but the rest of the house had the spacious, slightly neglected feel that gave it character. Everything seemed fine at first. One evening, after a long day of unpacking and settling in, I decided to take a bath. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones. The kind that makes you hyper-aware of every creak of the floorboards, every tiny shift of the house settling under its own weight. I undressed quickly and stepped into the warm water. The steam fogged up the mirror above the sink, but it didn't bother me. In fact, I liked the way the condensation made the room feel even cozier. I relaxed into the bath, my thoughts drifting with the hum of the house's old pipes. But as I closed my eyes, something caught my attention. There was a noise. A soft scrape. At first, I thought it was just the sound of water dripping from the faucet, but then it came again. Faint, almost imperceptible. A movement. I opened my eyes and turned my head toward the mirror. What I saw made my heart skip. A handprint. It was faint, but there, clear as day, the outline of a hand on the misted-up glass. The palm was open, the fingers splayed wide, the marks left by something or someone pressing against the glass. I leaned forward, staring at it. My breath fogged up the mirror even more, and the handprint slowly faded as the steam thickened. I assumed it was just from the condensation and didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was from when I had splashed water around earlier. But when I wiped the mirror with my towel, the handprint didn't disappear. It lingered. A chill ran down my spine. I wiped harder, but it wouldn't budge. The marks were stubborn, as though they were etched into the glass itself. After a moment, I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe even a stain I hadn't noticed earlier. I wasn't about to let a little thing like this unsettle me, especially not after a long day. I finished my bath, dried off, and walked away from the bathroom, my mind on other things. I didn't give it much thought as I got dressed. But something about that handprint wouldn't let me go. It was the next night when I noticed it again. I had gone to bed early that evening, feeling unusually tired. I fell into a deep sleep, but at some point in the night, I woke up. I don't know why. Something was off. The house was too still, too quiet. I heard the faintest sound, like scratching. It was soft at first, like a finger running gently over glass. My heart began to race as I pushed the covers off and stood up. The house was dark, save for the moonlight that slipped in through the curtains. My feet hit the cold floor, sending a shock through my body. I walked to the bathroom, half hoping that it was all just my imagination. But when I turned the light on, I saw it again. The handprint. Only now, it was clearer, more defined. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was as if the print was waiting for me. It felt personal, like someone had been watching me. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't just me. There was something in the mirror. Something in the shadows, lurking just beyond the edge of the glass. A chill crawled up my spine. My fingers trembled as I reached out to touch the mirror, but just before I made contact, I heard a soft whisper. "Leave, now!" The words were faint, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had heard them at all. But they echoed in my mind, repeating, growing louder. My hand hovered just above the surface of the mirror, my breath shallow as I fought to steady my racing pulse. I quickly wiped the mirror with a towel again, harder this time, hoping to erase the eerie imprint. The handprint didn't disappear. It only deepened, the edges becoming sharper. My hand recoiled, but my eyes were fixed on the reflection, on the space just beyond the mirror's edge. Then I saw it. A figure. A shadow, dark and elongated, standing just out of view. I turned my head sharply, but there was nothing. Just the empty bathroom behind me. My heart pounded, and I backed away, my mind racing. Was I seeing things? Was I losing my grip on reality? I had to be. There was no other explanation. But the handprint remained. And it wouldn't go away. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made sure to wipe the mirror clean once more, convinced that the night before was just a fluke. I didn't mention it to anyone. What would I say? I didn't want to sound crazy. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And when night fell, I steeled myself for what was to come. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that this was just the beginning. The handprints would come back. And every night, they would get a little clearer. A little more defined. A little harder to ignore. And soon, I wouldn't just see the handprints. I'd start hearing the whispers. The second night wasn't as peaceful as the first. By the time the sun set, I could feel the tension building in the air, thick like the fog outside. I tried to ignore it, pretending that nothing had changed, that the house was just as it had been when I first moved in. But every step I took felt heavier, like the house was watching me, waiting. I didn't want to go back into the bathroom, but I knew I had to. The handprints would return, and I couldn't keep pretending they weren't there. That night, I prepared myself. I had taken extra care to clean the mirror earlier in the evening, wiping it down until it gleamed, leaving no trace of the marks from the night before. But even as I stepped away from the sink, I could already feel the unease creeping in. It was the stillness that bothered me most, the silence that filled the house every night, broken only by the occasional groan of the old pipes. I climbed into bed, trying to push away the creeping thoughts. I pulled the covers tight around me, trying to make myself feel safe, trying to convince myself that the handprints were nothing more than a strange fluke. But the whispering came again. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling sound, like fabric shifting in the dark. Then it grew louder, more distinct. The sound of fingers trailing across glass. Scratching. Rubbing. Like someone was deliberately leaving marks on the mirror. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering in my chest. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I rushed to the bathroom, dreading what I might find. My fingers trembled as I flicked on the light. There they were. The handprints. But this time, they weren't just faint impressions. No, these marks were deeper, clearer. The fingers were more defined, the palm more pronounced. It was as if someone had pressed their hand to the mirror with enough force to leave an impression, one that couldn't be wiped away. I stepped closer, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The handprints looked fresh, as if someone had just placed their hand there. The edges of the fingers seemed almost too sharp, too detailed for something that had just appeared from condensation. I wiped the mirror again, this time more urgently, but the marks remained. They didn't budge. They were there to stay. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the handprints. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, coming from behind me, just over my shoulder. "Help me." I froze, blood running cold. My heart skipped a beat as I whipped around, but the room was empty. Nothing but the flickering light above the sink and the faint mist creeping up the mirror. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt a sickening pressure in my chest, like I was suffocating. I stared at the mirror again. The handprints seemed to mock me, their presence unexplainable. It was impossible. There was no way they could reappear every night like this. And yet, here they were. I turned away from the bathroom, my head spinning. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of trick with the steam, maybe something in the glass had caused the marks to appear in the same place. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something other. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, swirling around me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house with me, something that wanted me to see the handprints, something that needed me to notice them. I didn't know how, but I knew then, the handprints weren't just appearing. They were being left. Left by someone, or something, that was trying to make contact. That night, I stayed awake, watching the bathroom door, waiting for the whispering to stop. But it didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, soft, barely audible, like a breath brushing against my ear. The sound of fingers running along glass. Scraping. Leaving their mark. The next morning, I went to work as usual, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My mind kept drifting back to the bathroom, to the mirror, to the handprints. No matter how hard I tried to focus on anything else, the thought of them consumed me. That evening, I couldn't resist the urge to look again. I knew it wouldn't change anything. I knew the marks would be there, waiting for me. But I had to look. I had to understand. I walked into the bathroom, not even bothering to wipe the mirror. The handprints were already there, as expected. But this time, they were different. They were moving. Not in the way a person might think of moving, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. The fingers were twitching, flexing, as if they were trying to reach out. I watched, horrified, as the handprints seemed to shift, the fingers stretching toward me, the palm opening as though beckoning me to come closer. A loud, desperate whisper filled the room. "Help me. Please." It was no longer just a faint whisper. This time, the voice was desperate, begging. It wasn't just a presence in the room anymore. It was real, and it wanted something from me. I stepped back, unable to look away. I couldn't breathe. The air in the bathroom grew thick, oppressive. I could feel the weight of the presence behind the mirror, pressing against me. The handprints continued to twitch, stretching toward me as though they were alive. And in that moment, I knew that I was no longer just dealing with strange marks on a mirror. I was dealing with something far darker. Something that had been waiting for me, patiently, in the shadows. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispering, feel the weight of the handprints pressing against my thoughts, urging me to do something. But what could I do? The house felt like a prison, the walls closing in around me with each passing hour. I had never felt so alone, so trapped. The next morning, I was exhausted. But I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Something had to be done. The handprints, they weren't just random. They were a message. A warning. I had to figure out what they wanted before they drove me mad. I returned to the bathroom that morning, my mind racing. The light flickered above the sink, casting an eerie glow across the room. I stared at the mirror, feeling that familiar pull in my chest. The handprints were still there, just like before. But this time, they seemed different. The fingers were no longer twitching, but they were darker, more defined, as if the mark had deepened overnight. I reached for the towel and wiped the glass, but they stayed. I wiped harder, desperation setting in, but the marks only grew more vivid. They etched into the surface now, as if they were part of the mirror itself. Suddenly, something stopped me. I noticed a small detail in the handprint, something I hadn't seen before, a symbol. A line through the center of the palm. It was faint at first, but as I leaned closer, it became clearer. A strange, jagged mark, almost like a scar, cutting through the center of the handprint. It felt wrong. Not like something naturally formed from condensation, but like a deliberate design, something that was placed there with intent. I stepped back, my heart racing. There was no way this could be normal. I had to know more. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I decided to investigate the house. The previous owner, an elderly woman, had lived there for decades before she passed away. There were no relatives to inherit the house, and it had been left to rot for a long time before it was put on the market. But that didn't mean there wasn't a story hidden somewhere, a reason why the house felt so alive with its secrets. I started with the attic. The room was dusty and cramped, full of old boxes and forgotten furniture. But as I searched, I found something strange, a box buried under layers of old linens and books. Inside, There was an old, leather-bound journal. It looked ancient, like it had been untouched for years. I opened it carefully, running my fingers over the yellowed pages, and began to read. The entries were odd, disjointed, almost frantic at times. The handwriting was shaky, as if the writer had been losing their mind. The entries began normally enough, but as I read further, the tone shifted. The writer spoke of strange occurrences, unexplainable noises, whispers in the dark, shadows that moved on their own. And then, there was something else. Something that chilled me to my core. The last few pages were filled with references to the bathroom mirror. The writer, a woman named Margaret, wrote about a hand reaching from the glass, a presence that pressed its palm against the mirror at night. She described how the handprints would appear each evening, no matter how hard she cleaned. She even mentioned the symbol in the palm, the jagged line that was always present. She spoke of an entity that lived behind the glass, one that had been there for years, trapped in the mirror by some dark force. She wrote that it needed something to escape, something human, and it would stop at nothing to get it. I felt my stomach twist as I read on. The last entry was the most unsettling. Margaret wrote that the mirror had begun to speak to her, whispering her name at night, begging for help. But the more she tried to understand, the more the entity demanded. She said it would never stop, never let go. It would keep coming back, night after night, until it had claimed what it wanted. And then the final line, "I am the mirror now." I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. The pieces were falling into place, but I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't be trapped in this nightmare, this endless cycle of whispers and handprints. But the journal was clear. The house was cursed. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a portal, an entryway for something that was stuck, something that couldn't escape without help. The handprints, the whispers, the growing sense of dread, it was all leading to this. The entity behind the glass wasn't just trying to make contact, it was trying to break through. I had to act fast. I couldn't let it get to me. I couldn't become like Margaret. I wouldn't let the mirror consume me. I raced down to the bathroom, my mind spinning. The mirror was waiting for me, its surface fogged, the handprint still etched into the glass. This time, though, I could see the symbol more clearly. The jagged line in the palm. It looked almost like a scar, as if something had been carved into the mirror. I felt the presence before I saw it. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the space around me was closing in. The whispering began again, louder this time, desperate. "Please, help me." I reached out, my hand trembling, not knowing what I was doing. But I couldn't resist. I touched the mirror. The cold glass felt like ice under my fingers, and in that moment, I felt something else, a sharp pull, like I was being dragged toward the mirror, toward the handprints. My fingers dug into the surface, and then I heard it. A voice, louder than before. A growl. An angry, tortured growl. "Let me out." The mirror shook, vibrating under my touch. I yanked my hand away, but it was too late. The handprints moved. They shifted. The symbol in the palm began to glow, its jagged lines illuminating the entire bathroom. The whispers turned into screams. The mirror rippled like water, and then everything went black. I woke up on the floor, disoriented and cold. The bathroom was silent again. The mirror was normal. No handprints. No symbol. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been trapped behind the glass hadn't let me go. It was still here. And now, it knew my name. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The silence felt suffocating, and the weight of the mirror was too much to bear. I had to leave before whatever was behind that glass reached out again. But even as I made the decision to pack my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The mirror was quiet now, but I knew it wasn't gone. Whatever was in it, whatever had been pressing against the glass, was waiting. I could feel its presence in the corners of my mind, lurking like a shadow, waiting for its next opportunity. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering my belongings, my movements mechanical, my heart pounding with each passing moment. But every time I looked at the bathroom door, I felt a pull, an unnatural tug toward it. It was as if the mirror was calling me, drawing me in. I knew I had to get out of there before it was too late. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore the feeling, it only grew stronger. When I finished packing, I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. The idea of walking out that door, of leaving the mirror behind, felt like a final act of surrender. I wasn't sure what would happen if I stayed, but I was certain that I couldn't let it take me. I went back into the bathroom one last time. The mirror was still there, its surface smooth and undisturbed. But I knew better now. I knew it wasn't just a mirror. It was a gateway. I reached out, my fingers hovering just inches from the glass. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder. The coldness returned, wrapping around me like a heavy fog. Help me. Please. I jerked my hand back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My mind raced, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let it pull me in. But the mirror seemed to pull at me with every passing second, its reflection distorting, rippling like water. The surface shimmered, and I could swear I saw movement in it, figures shifting and twisting just out of view. I backed away slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, louder this time. Let me out. The voice was no longer soft. It was angry. It was real. I spun around, my stomach turning as I watched the mirror twist and warp. The reflection in the glass was no longer my own. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize, someone with eyes that seemed hollow and empty. The figure in the mirror reached toward me, its fingers pressing against the glass, leaving behind fresh handprints. I screamed, stumbling backward as I realized the figure was trying to break through. It was reaching for me. The handprints on the mirror seemed to stretch, expanding toward me, and I felt a sharp, icy cold rush through my veins. I ran. I didn't care about the house anymore. I didn't care about anything except getting away from the mirror, from the entity that was trying to drag me back. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I raced for the front door, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the house like a drumbeat of impending doom. But the door wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, but it was stuck, as if the house itself was holding me in. I turned and looked behind me. The mirror was there, still glowing with an unnatural light, its surface now rippling like water, distorting the image of the room around me. And then, through the distorted glass, I saw it. The figure from the mirror was standing in the doorway behind me, its hollow eyes staring at me, its fingers still pressing against the glass, reaching through to me. It was no longer trapped. It had found its way out. I turned, but the door wouldn't open. Panic rose in my chest as I realized I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. No way to escape. The whispers grew louder, turning into a deafening roar. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, its hand now reaching out of the glass. I screamed, throwing myself against the door in a last-ditch attempt to break free. The figure's fingers were almost on me now, its icy touch brushing my skin. But then, in that moment of utter terror, the mirror cracked. It didn't shatter, but a deep crack split the glass, running from top to bottom. The figure in the mirror froze, its hands suspended in midair, as if time had stopped. The air was thick with tension as the crack widened, and I could feel the cold air rushing out from the mirror. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was my chance. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if the figure was still there, if it had followed me. I just ran, my mind racing with thoughts of escape, of survival. I burst out of the house and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I was far away, until the house was nothing more than a dark silhouette in the distance. I collapsed on the ground, trembling, as the reality of what had just happened hit me. The mirror, the entity behind it, was still out there, and it was still looking for a way to get to me. I had escaped, for now. But I knew the mirror would never let me go. It would always be waiting. And one day, I would have to face it again. Because the mirror's grip was unrelenting. And it would never stop until it had what it wanted. Me. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the crack in the mirror, the hollow eyes of the figure, its outstretched hand reaching for me. I tried to bury the memory, tried to convince myself it was over, that I had escaped. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. Weeks passed. Life tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. I moved to a new place, far from the house, far from the mirror. I kept busy, filled my days with distractions. I even tried to forget about the whispers, the handprints. But the mirror, it wouldn't let me forget. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A reflection out of the corner of my eye. A fleeting shadow in the glass. The whispers began again, faint at first, as if they were coming from far away. But soon, they grew louder, more insistent. And then, one night, it happened. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror in my new apartment, brushing my teeth, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The house was behind me, the mirror was behind me. The past, I thought, was behind me. But when I glanced up at the mirror, I froze. The surface rippled. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no, it wasn't. The glass began to distort, twisting like water, warping the reflection of the room behind me. And there, in the reflection, I saw it. The figure. It wasn't standing behind me like before. It was standing in the mirror. Its face was clearer now, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its mouth twisted into a grin that seemed far too wide. The same handprint symbol was etched into its palm, glowing faintly in the dim light. Let me out. The voice was clear this time, unmistakable, coming from within the mirror itself. My blood ran cold as I backed away from the glass. I turned to run, but the door to the bathroom slammed shut. The walls around me seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. The mirror's surface rippled again, the figure's hand pressing against the glass, its fingers stretching as if it was trying to reach out. I had to escape, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, like the mirror's pull had paralyzed me. Please, help me. The figure's voice echoed through the room, filling the space with a sense of dread. I could feel it pulling me in, wrapping its cold fingers around my thoughts, digging into my mind. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, if I was going crazy, or if it was real. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't let it get to me. I couldn't let it take me again. With a burst of desperation, I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I yanked the handle. The door flew open, and I stumbled out of the bathroom, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I looked back, I saw the reflection. It wasn't the bathroom anymore. The mirror had changed. The room was now a twisted, distorted version of my own apartment. The furniture was upside down, the walls peeling and crumbling. The figure was still there, standing in the middle of the room, staring at me with those hollow eyes, its hands stretched out toward me. I couldn't breathe. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore, it was a doorway. A gateway. And it was calling me. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, out of the apartment, down the hallway, through the building, until I was out in the street. The cool night air hit me like a shock, but it didn't help. The whispers were still there, faint, like a distant hum in my ears. I looked around, but there was nowhere to hide. No way to escape. The mirror wasn't just in the house. It was with me. It had followed me. I thought I was safe. But I wasn't. I wasn't safe anywhere. The whispers grew louder again, the cold creeping into my bones. I could feel the presence behind me, the entity from the mirror closing in. It was getting closer, and I could hear its voice, its angry, desperate voice, growing stronger. Let me out. Let me out. I couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere left to go. I turned, and there it was. The mirror. It wasn't on a wall anymore. It wasn't just a piece of glass hanging in the room. It had appeared in front of me, floating in the air like an ominous, twisted portal. And through it, I could see the figure, its hands still reaching for me, its eyes still locked on mine. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. And then, the whispers stopped. There was no sound. No voice. No movement. Just the stillness of the night. But I wasn't alone. I looked into the mirror, and I saw my own face. Only, it wasn't my face. It was distorted, twisted into a grotesque mask of fear. My own reflection was smiling at me, its eyes wide and empty. Its hand, too, reached out toward me, just like the figure in the mirror. I knew then. The mirror didn't just trap those who touched it. It became them. It consumed them. And I had been marked from the start. I was the one trapped now. I was the one in the mirror. And I would never escape. Have you ever wondered what your neighbors do when the world sleeps? What secrets they hide behind their closed doors in the silence of the night? I didn't think much about my neighbor, Mr. Carter, at first. He was just another face in the building, a quiet man, rarely seen, but never causing any trouble. He lived across the hall from me, a few doors down. His door was always closed, the hallway lights never seemed to touch it, and I'd hear nothing from his apartment, nothing but silence. At first, it didn't strike me as unusual. Most people keep to themselves, right? I assumed he was simply a private man, perhaps even a little eccentric. But as the days turned into weeks, something started to feel off. Every night, without fail, Mr. Carter would leave his apartment. It wasn't the time that bothered me, it was the way he left. He would step into the hall just after midnight, always in the same dark jacket, his head down, as if avoiding the faint light that flickered from the hallway. And he never made a sound. No footsteps, no creak of the floorboards, no rustling of fabric. Just the faintest opening and closing of his door, then silence again. For the first few nights, I brushed it off. It was just a coincidence, right? People are night owls. Some of us have odd schedules. But the longer I lived in that building, the more I began to notice that it was every night. Mr. Carter only ever left at night, as if the daylight hours didn't exist for him. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know where he was going. One night, I decided to follow him. I waited until the clock struck midnight, when I knew his routine would begin. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood by my door, listening. The faintest click of the lock told me he was on his way. I crept quietly toward the peephole, peering out into the hallway. There he was, just like always. Mr. Carter, stepping into the hall, his back hunched slightly, his gaze down. I could barely make out his features, the hallway light dimming his face, casting long shadows. He moved with purpose, walking down the corridor toward the staircase. But this time, I didn't stay hidden behind the peephole. I had to follow him, had to know where he went. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the door, careful not to make a sound. I waited for a moment, watching the dim shape of Mr. Carter's figure disappear around the corner of the hallway. I moved quickly, my footsteps soft on the carpet, making sure not to make a sound as I trailed behind him. He didn't stop at the staircase. He didn't stop at the elevator. He kept walking, further down the corridor, past the mailboxes, past the maintenance room. The further we went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The hallways seemed darker, and the lights buzzed faintly above, casting an eerie glow over everything. The air felt thick, as if something heavy was pressing down. Then, something unexpected happened. Mr. Carter stopped in front of a door I had never noticed before. It was at the very end of the hall, just before it turned into darkness. The door was old, scratched, with a rusted knob that seemed out of place in the otherwise well-maintained building. He didn't knock. He didn't pause. He simply opened it, as if he knew it was waiting for him. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I had to see what he was doing. I had to know. I stepped closer, just a few feet from the door. I could hear the faintest sound, a scraping noise, followed by a low, muffled creak. Then, Mr. Carter disappeared into the darkness behind the door. But as I stood there, staring at the blackness, I realized something. There were no sounds. No footsteps. No doors closing. No sound at all. I waited. And waited. Minutes passed. But still, nothing. The silence in the hallway was thick, almost suffocating, and the door was still ajar, no sign of Mr. Carter. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of movement. But there was nothing. I stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, my hand hovering near the door. I had to see what was behind it. I pushed it open, and for a moment, nothing seemed out of place. The room behind the door was a small, windowless storage space filled with old furniture and boxes. But then, I heard it. A soft click. It came from the far corner of the room. I turned sharply, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I stepped forward, my hands shaking. Then, I noticed it. The wall. There was something strange about it. A small seam, barely noticeable at first, running down the middle of the wall. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I traced the edge of the seam. And then the wall moved. It didn't just shift. It slid open, like a hidden door, revealing an even darker passage beyond. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out. As I turned to run, I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper or a low breath coming from the shadows. Then, Mr. Carter's voice. "You shouldn't have followed me." The door slammed shut behind me, and I froze in the dark hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. But I knew something had changed. I wasn't alone. And neither was he. The next day felt like a dream, one that I was trapped in, unable to wake from. The sounds of the building, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the overhead lights, all seemed muffled, distant. I couldn't shake the image of that door, the one Mr. Carter had disappeared behind. What was that place? What had I seen? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I had imagined it, that it was just a trick of my mind, a natural curiosity mixed with too much time alone. But as I stood in the hallway that morning, my eyes kept drifting toward the door at the end, the one where I had seen Mr. Carter vanish. It seemed to be waiting for me, silently daring me to look again. I had to know. The apartment was empty. I had the whole day to think about it, to plan. But the more I thought, the more I realized I didn't have a choice. I had already crossed a line by following him. And now, there was no turning back. I waited for night to fall, counting the hours as they slowly dragged by. When the sky outside finally turned dark, I felt a tightening in my chest. I couldn't stop the pulse of fear racing through my veins. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, it did. Just after midnight, the familiar sound of Mr. Carter's door creaked open. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I knew it was him. He had done it again. He was leaving, just like every other night. But this time, I didn't follow him immediately. I waited. I waited to see if he would go down the hallway again. When I heard the faint shuffle of his footsteps echoing in the distance, I knew he was going toward the door, the one that had led to the hidden passage. I moved quietly, staying in the shadows, my breath shallow as I crept down the hallway after him. I didn't dare to make a sound. I reached the door. The same one. The one that looked so out of place in this old building. The handle was cold to the touch as I gripped it, my pulse pounding in my ears. The darkness in the hallway seemed to grow heavier, pressing against me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind it. I twisted the knob slowly. The door didn't creak as I had expected. Instead, it opened with a soft, effortless push. Inside, the room was just as I had left it, dim and quiet. The old furniture was scattered about, the boxes piled high in the corners. But the wall, that wall, was still there, slightly ajar, revealing the narrow passage beyond. I didn't hesitate. My heart was thudding loudly in my chest as I stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The passage seemed to stretch far beyond the small room, a dark tunnel that led to the unknown. I could feel my stomach twist in knots, but there was no turning back now. Mr. Carter had been through here, and I was determined to find out where it led. The further I walked, the darker it got. The walls closed in around me, and the faint light from the hallway seemed to fade, swallowed by the oppressive blackness of the passage. My steps were tentative at first, my feet dragging against the cold, damp floor. Every sound seemed amplified, the soft scrape of my shoes, the quickened beat of my heart, the ragged breath escaping my mouth. But then, I heard something. A low creak. A shuffle. Someone was ahead. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was movement, faint but distinct. It was the sound of someone walking, not far away. Mr. Carter? I took a step forward, my foot brushing against something hard. I couldn't see it in the dark, but I didn't want to know what it was. I kept moving, the walls pressing closer with every step. The passage seemed to wind and twist, turning in on itself, and I started to feel disoriented. Then, I saw it. A faint light. It flickered ahead, just around the corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I had to know what it was. I rounded the corner, and my breath caught in my throat. The passage opened up into a small, dimly lit room. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly energy, their lines shifting as if alive. And in the center of the room stood Mr. Carter. But he wasn't alone. There were other figures, shadows, blurry and indistinct, but undeniably there. They were standing in a circle, facing each other, their heads lowered. And in the middle, at the heart of the room, was a large, blackened mirror. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, watching in horror as Mr. Carter and the others continued their silent ritual, their figures slowly swaying back and forth. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow brighter, their shapes twisting and contorting as if they were alive. And then, one of the figures raised its head. It was looking right at me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My legs were frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure's eyes were dark, empty pits that seemed to pierce right through me. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand. But I knew one thing for sure. I shouldn't have come here. And now, I was trapped. The figure's gaze was like a cold hand on my skin, creeping across my body, freezing me in place. Its eyes, empty and black, felt as if they could see inside me, probing my thoughts, my fears, my darkest secrets. I wanted to look away, to run, but my body refused to obey. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of energy that seemed to pulse from the mirror. The air itself felt thick, charged with something I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My eyes were fixed on the figure, unable to tear away as it slowly raised its hand, beckoning me. I didn't understand why, but my feet moved on their own. It was as if I was being drawn into the room against my will. I stepped forward, each footfall slow and heavy, the air growing colder with each step. Then, the low murmur began. It was barely audible at first, a series of soft whispers, like distant voices calling from far away. But as I approached the circle, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The figures surrounding the mirror began to move in unison, their heads tilting slightly, as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear. And then, the whisper became a chant. A low, rhythmic chant in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The words seemed to press into my mind, filling me with a sense of dread I had never known. The chant was calling to something dark, something ancient. I could feel its power growing, swirling around me like a storm. I couldn't stop. My feet were dragging me closer, unwillingly. The mirror in the center of the room reflected nothing. It was just a black void, like staring into the emptiness of space. But there was someone standing in the reflection. It wasn't me. It was another figure, tall and faceless, cloaked in shadow. The reflection seemed to shift and ripple, as if the figure was moving closer, reaching out to me. The coldness of the room seemed to intensify, and the air grew thick with a tangible presence, as if the mirror was no longer just glass, but a doorway into something else. My pulse raced. I tried to stop, tried to turn away, but my body refused to listen. I was too close now, too deep into whatever this was. The figure in the reflection stretched a hand toward me, its fingers long and pale, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My head was filled with the chant, the whispers, the pressure of something dark pushing against my mind. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The figure's hand was inches from mine. And then, something snapped. The mirror shattered. It didn't explode outward with a crash. It wasn't a violent shattering. It was more like it simply dissolved into nothingness, a ripple of darkness that spread through the air, swallowing the figures in the room. For a brief moment, I was surrounded by pure blackness, my eyes unable to adjust to the absence of light. And then, the light returned. But it was different. The room was gone. The figures were gone. The walls were gone. I was standing in a vast, empty space, as if the entire world had vanished. The floor beneath my feet was soft, almost like sand, but there was no ground beneath me. It was as if I was floating in nothingness, surrounded by an unbroken, endless void. The only thing that remained was the mirror. It was in front of me now, its surface smooth and undisturbed, but it wasn't just a reflection of the room. It showed something else. Something wrong. The figure in the mirror was still there. But now, its face was clear. It was staring at me with cold, empty eyes. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and I could hear its voice, low, guttural, like a growl from the deepest parts of the earth. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. I wanted to run, to flee, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. I could feel its power, its pull, dragging me closer, pulling me into its depths. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a doorway into something I couldn't understand. And then, the figure spoke again. "You're already here," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You always were." The words sent a jolt of panic through me. I couldn't comprehend what it meant. What was it saying? How could I always have been here? I had just followed Mr. Carter. I had just stepped into that room, into that passage. Hadn't I? The mirror seemed to grow larger, its surface stretching, expanding, as if it was opening up to swallow me whole. The figure's smile widened, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, showing rows of jagged teeth that looked far too sharp to be human. And then it reached out. I tried to scream. I tried to break free from the force pulling me forward. But I was helpless, frozen in place, as the figure's hand moved closer, its fingers elongating, stretching toward me. I couldn't stop it. It was too late. The darkness consumed me. And then, there was nothing. I woke up with a gasp, my body jerking as if I had been holding my breath for an eternity. I was back in my apartment. The room was dark, the air still. For a moment, I wasn't sure if what I had experienced was real. The sense of weightlessness, the overwhelming darkness, the feeling of something ancient closing in on me, all of it felt too real to be a dream. But I wasn't alone. The door to my apartment creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Carter. His eyes were empty, and his smile was the same twisted grin I had seen in the mirror. "Welcome home," he said softly. I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered in my chest as though it might explode. Mr. Carter's figure loomed in the doorway, but he was different now, more than just a man. His presence filled the room, thick and oppressive. The air itself felt alive, charged with a sinister energy that seemed to press in on me from all sides. What do you want?" I croaked, my voice trembling. My legs felt weak, as if they might give out beneath me. Mr. Carter didn't move. His eyes, those dark, empty eyes, were fixed on me, as though they could see through me. His smile didn't waver, and I felt something inside me twist in fear. Something wasn't right. "I've been waiting for you," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, like the murmur of a distant wind. The sound seemed to swirl around me, filling the room. "You've always been a part of this place." I stepped back, my back hitting the wall behind me. My breathing was ragged, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare I had just woken from. The mirror, the figures, the chant, it was all real, wasn't it? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? "No," I whispered, shaking my head. This can't be real." His smile widened, stretching unnaturally wide, his mouth now far too large for a human. His teeth gleamed white in the darkness, jagged and sharp like the fangs of some predator. "It's all real," he said, his voice echoing around me as if it were coming from all directions. "You can't escape it. You've already crossed the threshold." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. What did he mean by threshold? What was he talking about? And why was his voice so familiar? It wasn't just the words. There was something in the tone, in the rhythm of his speech, that felt like I had heard it before. But I couldn't place it. Suddenly, a memory rushed forward, clear and vivid, of a time long ago. It was from my childhood, a moment I had almost forgotten. My mother's voice, soothing, comforting, as she tucked me into bed. "Always stay away from mirrors," she had told me, her tone serious, her eyes wide with fear. "They can show you things that aren't supposed to be seen." I shuddered, the connection clicking into place. The figure, the smile, the darkness, I had seen them before. But it wasn't just a dream. It was real. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I don't want this. I just want to leave." But Mr. Carter didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, slowly, his presence filling the small space of my apartment. As he moved closer, the air seemed to grow colder. His shadow stretched out, twisting across the walls like some monstrous creature coming to life. "You've already left," he murmured, his smile never fading. "This is where you belong now." I didn't understand. I didn't know what he meant. And yet, a deep, primal part of me understood all too well. I turned toward the door, my mind screaming for me to run, to escape. But as my hand reached for the doorknob, I froze. The room had changed. The hallway outside my apartment was no longer just a hallway. It was an endless expanse of darkness, stretching far beyond the point where the light from my apartment ended. The walls seemed to close in around me, the space narrowing. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The reflection of the hallway in the mirror. No! There was no mirror. There was nothing but the darkness, the oppressive void. "You're already part of this place," Mr. Carter's voice echoed, now coming from all directions. "You always have been." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I spun around, heart racing, to find Mr. Carter standing in the center of the room. His smile remained, but his eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were full of something darker. Something cold. "You've crossed over," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "And now, you will stay." I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the walls seemed to close in around me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The world outside my apartment, the world I thought I knew, was gone. The air felt thick with something I couldn't describe, something ancient and suffocating. I was no longer sure where the apartment ended and the darkness began. The mirror. The hallway. The darkness that stretched on forever. It was all part of the same thing, the same endless loop. I had stepped into it. I had followed Mr. Carter, and now there was no way back. "You'll never leave," Mr. Carter repeated, his voice now a low, almost loving murmur. His shadows seemed to grow, his form stretching and warping, no longer human. He was something else now, something I couldn't comprehend, a force that existed beyond the limits of the world I thought I knew. He stepped closer, his hand outstretched, as if inviting me to join him in whatever dark place this was. "No," I whispered. "No, please." But my voice was swallowed by the silence. And then, the mirror appeared again, suddenly, impossibly, on the far wall, reflecting nothing but darkness. I didn't understand. The walls had no reflection. The room had no edges. I was lost. But the mirror, it was still there. The figure stood within it once again, waiting, smiling. The edges of my vision began to blur. The dark figures in the mirror were reaching out toward me. I could hear their chant again, soft but insistent, pulling me into the cold emptiness. "You're already here." The words echoed in my mind. And then, there was nothing. I woke up to silence. But the room was still the same. The mirror wasn't gone. It was watching me. Again. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had just experienced was a dream, a terrifying, vivid dream that still held me captive. I was no longer sure of what was real. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, like something had shifted in the space I had once known. But the more I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the more the evidence around me told a different story. I could see it clearly now, the way the mirror on the wall reflected not only my image but the darkness that had enveloped it. The chill in the air, the way the shadows seemed to flicker unnaturally, the distant sound of something scraping against the floor, everything about the room felt wrong. I had to get out. But as I moved toward the door, my eyes locked onto the mirror once more. The figure within it, Mr. Carter, was still there, watching me with that same predatory smile. His eyes were cold, void of anything human. I could feel the pull of them, the magnetic force drawing me in. I froze. I had to stop. Why can't I escape? I whispered to myself. My voice was barely audible over the growing tension. I reached for the door, but something stopped me. The walls around me felt different, closer, more constricted. The weight of the air was pressing down on me, and my breath was shallow, each inhale trembling as I tried to hold on to my sanity. It was then that I noticed it. A figure, another one, had appeared in the corner of the room, emerging from the shadows. A darker, more distorted version of Mr. Carter, like a reflection of a reflection. The shape was shifting, flickering, like a malfunctioning television screen, its edges blurring into the darkness. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The figure in the mirror began to speak, its voice not coming from its lips, but from the very air around me. It wasn't just Mr. Carter's voice now, it was a chorus, multiple voices layered over one another, speaking in unison. The sound was haunting, reverberating through my skull. "You thought you could escape," it murmured, its tone dripping with malice, "but you've been here all along." I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The world around me twisted again. The room began to melt, the edges warping as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The door was gone. The walls, the ceiling, they all began to stretch into an infinite void. There was no space, no safety. Only that voice, growing louder, more insistent. "You've crossed over," it repeated, "and now you belong here." I couldn't breathe. The darkness around me was suffocating, and the more I tried to fight it, the more it seemed to swallow me whole. The mirror, no, the reflection, wasn't just showing Mr. Carter anymore. It was showing me, but not the version I recognized. The version in the mirror was distorted, its eyes black, its face twisted in an agonizing expression. I watched in horror as it reached out from the mirror, its hand breaking through the glass like it was made of liquid, its fingers inching closer, wrapping around my wrist. "No!" I screamed, pulling my arm back, but the force was too strong. The hand tightened around me, dragging me forward, toward the mirror. The edge of the glass was cold against my skin, but I couldn't pull away. I was trapped, caught between reality and something else, something unnatural. Then, just as the cold fingers tightened their grip, the door to the apartment burst open with a force that shook the walls. It was the neighbor, Mr. Carter. But he wasn't the same. His eyes were wide, desperate. His face was pale, drenched in sweat. He staggered into the room, looking frantic. "No," he cried, his voice breaking. "You don't understand. You need to get out of here. It's too late. The mirror, it doesn't let you leave." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. What are you talking about?" Mr. Carter's face was contorted with fear, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It pulls you in. I tried to warn you. I tried to stop it." His words barely registered in my mind as I tried to focus on the hand that had gripped me. My heart pounded as the pressure grew stronger. The figure in the mirror, it was me. It was pulling me into the reflection. Mr. Carter reached out to me, his hand grabbing mine, but the mirror's force was overwhelming. He pulled at me with all his strength, his body shaking. "Please," he shouted. "Don't let it take you." I felt myself being torn between two worlds, between the reflection and the reality I once knew. The darkness pulled harder, colder. I could hear the whispers of the voices in my head again, telling me I belonged here, that I was one of them. And then, with a final scream, I was yanked away from the mirror. I was back in the room, in the real world, but the damage was done. The door slammed shut behind Mr. Carter. He collapsed to the floor, his face pale and empty. The room was still, the oppressive silence hanging in the air. And the mirror was gone. I turned to find that the space where it had once hung was now bare. There were no reflections, no shadows moving behind me. Only empty space. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Something had changed. The walls of the apartment felt different, as though they were no longer mine. I could feel it in my bones, the pressure, the pull. The space was alive now, aware of me. The whispering voices were faint but still there, lingering at the edge of my perception. I was no longer sure if I had escaped or if I had become part of whatever it was that haunted this place. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back. I had crossed over, and I was never going to leave. The mirror had claimed me. Have you ever found something so inexplicable, so utterly bizarre, that it seemed like it was meant just for you? Something that didn't belong in the world as you knew it, but yet it felt oddly familiar? That's what happened to me one evening at the library. It was a quiet evening, the kind that feels like time is frozen. I had just moved into the area a few weeks ago, and my only company was the books that filled the empty spaces of my apartment. I had become a regular at the local library, a small, older building tucked away on a narrow street. Most people barely noticed it, passing by as if it was just part of the background of their lives. But to me, it became a sanctuary, a place of solace. That day, I wandered through the aisles of worn-out books, each shelf stacked with stories that had been told and retold over the years. I was looking for something, though I wasn't sure what. Maybe a new mystery, a thriller, or even something more philosophical to distract me from the constant hum of anxiety that had begun to build in my life. As I walked past the rows of books, one particular book caught my eye. It wasn't anything special in terms of appearance. It was an old hardcover with a simple black cover, no title, no author. But there was something magnetic about it, something that made me stop and reach for it. When my fingers brushed against the cover, I felt a strange tingle run up my spine, a small, unsettling sensation that I tried to dismiss. I took the book to a quiet corner and sat down. There was an odd stillness to the library that day, the usual noises of footsteps and hushed conversations absent, as if the world outside had paused. I opened the book. The pages were completely blank. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Perhaps the pages had been torn out, or the ink had faded with age. But as I flipped through the pages, it became clear that there was no print of any kind, nothing but the whiteness of the paper staring back at me. Curiosity gripped me. I turned back to the first page and stared at it. Was this some sort of art project? A conceptual piece? But no, it didn't make sense. I had never seen anything like this before. It wasn't a book at all. It was an empty object, one that felt strangely alive in my hands. I closed the book and set it down on the table, intending to return it to the shelf. But before I could stand up, I noticed something strange. A shadow in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the dim lighting of the library, but then I saw it again, a quick flicker, like a movement from the corner of the page. I opened the book again, but this time, the emptiness was different. The blank pages were no longer as they had been before. Tiny words began to form, almost like they were emerging from the very fibers of the paper. They were faint at first, just barely visible, but they grew clearer as I stared at them. "You're not alone." My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, unsure if I was imagining things. I turned the page. The words were now larger, more distinct. "Do you remember what happened last night?" I looked around the library, my pulse quickening. There was no one else in sight. The library was still, quiet as ever. The words on the page seemed to watch me, as though they were waiting for my reaction. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of it. "Who's doing this?" I whispered to myself, but the answer didn't come. I turned the page again. This time, the words were longer, more specific. You sat at this table before. You thought you could escape, but you haven't. My breath caught in my throat. The words on the page, they knew me. They knew things about me that no one should know. I closed the book quickly, as if trying to shut out whatever was happening. I wanted to stand up, leave, but I couldn't. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was getting late. The library would be closing soon. But I couldn't bring myself to move, my fingers still trembling as I held the book. The fear was rising inside me, a creeping dread that something terrible was about to unfold. The words continued to appear as I stared at them, more insistent now. It was as though the book was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. I needed to get out. But as I stood up, something caught my attention, a sound. A low hum, faint but growing louder. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something unnatural. The hum seemed to come from the pages themselves, vibrating in my hands. I could hear it now, clear and sharp, as if the book was calling to me, beckoning me deeper. Then, with a sudden snap, the page turned on its own. I froze, my mind racing. This was impossible. This was impossible. The words on the page were no longer about the past. They were about me, right here, right now. You're not alone, and you never were. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly looked up from the book. The hum grew louder, like the sound of thousands of whispers, coming from every corner of the room. The walls of the library seemed to close in on me, and the air felt suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. And then, from the silence that followed, I heard it. A voice. But it wasn't my own. The voice was soft, but it echoed in my ears as though it came from inside my head. It was calm, almost soothing, yet there was something deeply unsettling about it. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt familiar. You should never have opened it, the voice whispered, its tone as cold as ice. I turned the book over in my hands, looking for some sign, some explanation. But the pages remained blank. The whispering continued, louder now, like it was surrounding me. You were never supposed to know. I stood frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to run out of the library and never return. But my legs refused to move. The air was thick, heavy, like I was underwater, and the weight of it kept me rooted to the spot. The voice grew more insistent, as if it could feel my fear, feeding off it. You've opened the door. Now you must stay inside. The words on the page shifted again, moving faster this time. They weren't just written anymore, they were alive. The letters seemed to pulse with a dark energy, rearranging themselves in quick, unpredictable patterns. And each time the book shifted, the voice echoed louder, closer. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My mouth was dry, my body shaking uncontrollably. The room around me began to warp, slowly at first, but then faster, as if reality itself was starting to bend. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement. My reflection in the nearby window. No, it wasn't my reflection anymore. It was distorted, twisted. The face staring back at me had hollow eyes, a twisted smile that wasn't my own. It moved, stepping closer to the glass, its expression darkening. I snapped my head away, my breath coming in short gasps. The voice continued, now a maddening cacophony of whispers, all speaking at once. Did you really think you could leave? Suddenly, the words on the pages vanished entirely, leaving nothing but blank sheets. But the hum persisted, rising in pitch until it almost felt like the room was vibrating. The walls seemed to pulse, bending with the rhythm of the sound. A feeling of dread swept over me, and I finally found the strength to stand. I ran. My feet pounded against the wooden floors, but it felt like I was running through thick mud, the weight of the air holding me back. I needed to get to the door, to escape, but every time I reached for the exit, it felt further away. The walls seemed to stretch, pulling the door out of reach, as though the space itself was mocking me. "Please, stop," I gasped, my voice barely audible. But the room wouldn't let me go. The shadows shifted as if they had a life of their own, curling around the edges of the library, creeping along the bookshelves. It was as though the very fabric of the place was alive, hungry, reaching out for me. I stumbled back toward the table, the book still there, waiting for me. The whispers grew louder as I approached, pressing on me from all sides. "You can't escape," they hissed, their voices merging into a single, unified chant. "You're already part of it." The pages of the book flipped open on their own, revealing more words that weren't there before. They were written in a language I couldn't understand, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as I stared at them. The book was no longer just a passive object. It was drawing me in, pulling me closer. In a panic, I tried to slam the book shut, but it wouldn't close. The pages resisted, like something was pushing back against me from the inside. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking as I fought to free myself from the book's grip. But the words on the pages changed again, this time forming a single sentence. "You belong here now." Suddenly, I felt it, something cold, creeping across my skin. The air turned icy, and I felt the presence of something else. Something that wasn't just in the room, but in the very walls. It was watching me, studying me, and it was waiting. I backed away slowly, the book still open on the table, its pages fluttering like they were alive. The shadows stretched longer, darker, as if they had minds of their own. I could hear breathing, slow, labored, as if something was lurking just behind me. The voice came again, this time clearer than ever. "Welcome." And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. The library wasn't just a building filled with books, it was a prison. A place where the boundaries between reality and something far darker had been blurred. And somehow, I had walked into it. I had opened the door. I turned and ran for the door again, desperation clawing at me, my fingers reaching for the handle. But as I touched it, the door swung open by itself. I looked out into the darkened hallway, but it wasn't the hallway I had seen before. It was different. There was no light, no sound. It was a void, a place where time and space seemed to stretch and warp. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, until they filled my mind entirely. "You can't leave." The door slammed shut behind me, and the world went black. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath, my hands clammy and trembling. The dark hallway that had surrounded me just moments before had vanished. Instead, I found myself in the library again, the cold, wooden floor beneath me and the faint smell of old paper filling the air. But it wasn't the same library. The space felt wrong, distorted somehow. The shelves of books loomed taller than before, and the once familiar sounds of the library were replaced by a deafening silence. Even the air felt different, thicker, heavier. I looked around, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had been in the hallway, no, the corridor, and then I had been pulled back into the library, but it was as if I had crossed over into another version of it, one that wasn't quite real. but I wasn't alone. I felt it before I saw it, a pressure in the air, a heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. It was like something where someone was watching me. I froze, my eyes darting across the room, searching for movement, for anything that might explain what was happening. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, near the back corner, was a shadow. At first, it looked like just another trick of the dim light, but as I stared at it, I saw it move. Slowly. Steadily. It was too deliberate to be an illusion. The shadow shifted, stretching and bending as if it were alive, pulling itself closer to me. I felt my chest tighten, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispers started again. They were soft at first, just a faint hum in the background, but they grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the walls themselves were murmuring, their voices blending together in a language I couldn't understand. "Where are you going?" the voice from the book asked, its tone taunting. "You can't escape." I swallowed hard, taking a shaky step backward. The shadow continued to approach, its form becoming clearer, more defined. I could see its outline now, tall and thin, like a person, but something was off. Its edges weren't sharp or clear. They blurred and shifted, as if the shadow itself was uncertain of its form. I backed up, my body moving instinctively, trying to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. But there was nowhere to go. The library seemed to stretch endlessly, the shelves closing in on me, the books filling the space like walls, trapping me. I reached for the book again. The strange one, the one that had started all this. I needed answers. Maybe I could find a way out if I just understood what was happening. But when I opened it, the pages were still blank. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with a chill that they were coming from the book itself. I looked down, and the words began to appear again, forming on the pages with a speed I couldn't follow. They weren't just words anymore, they were images too, flashing in and out, like a broken film reel. "You're here now," the book said, its words dancing on the page. "You are part of the story." The shadow moved closer. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The shadow seemed to pause, its form flickering for a brief moment, before it straightened, almost as if it was acknowledging my question. Then, without warning, it surged forward. I screamed, dropping the book in sheer panic, and stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. But the shadow was already there, reaching for me, its cold, inhuman fingers brushing against my skin. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, my eyes wide with terror. The shadow didn't seem to have any form, no face, no body, just darkness and movement. But I could feel it. Its presence, the way it seemed to absorb the light around it, leaving nothing but an endless void in its wake. "You're not meant to be here," the voice from the book hissed. "You opened the door. You can never leave." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't care. All I could think of was escaping. I grabbed the book off the floor, clutching it tightly to my chest. The words on the pages were still shifting, still changing, faster than before. "Help me," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was praying for someone or something else to hear me, or if I was begging the book for mercy. The shadow was almost upon me now, its form solidifying into something I could almost touch. I felt a coldness seep into my bones, an overwhelming chill that felt like it was freezing me from the inside out. I had no choice but to run again, pushing myself toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, I felt it, a tug, a pull at the very fabric of reality itself. The door was no longer a door. It was a wall, a solid barrier, as if the library had consumed it, claiming it as part of the space I could no longer leave. No! I screamed, trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows surrounded me now, closing in from all sides, their coldness pressing against me, suffocating me. I could hear the whispers again, louder than ever, drowning out my thoughts, filling my mind with darkness. And then, the shadow moved into the corner of my vision, too close. I couldn't escape. I had no way out. "You belong to it now," the voice said again, its words clear in my ears. I dropped to my knees, exhausted, defeated. I couldn't fight anymore. The walls of the library were closing in on me, the darkness stretching its fingers around my body, pulling me into the void. And as the last bit of light from the room flickered out, I understood. This wasn't just a library. It was a prison, and I had been its prisoner all along. I woke up with a jolt, my body shaking violently as I gasped for breath. The cold air of the room bit at my skin, and I was on the floor again, no longer in the library, but back in my apartment. The shadows had receded. The whispers had stopped. I was lying on the familiar carpet, in the same place where everything had started. But it was different now. The air felt too heavy, the silence too profound. I slowly pushed myself up, my head spinning. I scanned the room, my eyes searching for something that made sense. The walls seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and there was a sense of suffocating pressure, like the space itself was closing in on me. The book without words, was gone. I checked the nearby shelf, but it wasn't there. No trace of it remained. Was it all a dream? I didn't believe that for a second. The feeling in the pit of my stomach, the cold terror still clinging to my bones, told me otherwise. Something had happened. I had opened something that should never have been opened, and it had dragged me into its world. And then I heard it. A soft, faint whisper from somewhere deep in the apartment. So quiet I thought it might have been my imagination. But then, louder. "Where are you now?" I turned quickly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The voice was coming from the hallway. That familiar place, the corridor where the shadows had first appeared. I moved cautiously toward the sound, every step filled with dread. There was something about the hallway now that felt alive. The walls seemed to shift with each passing second, bending and stretching as if they were made of something other than solid matter. I was trapped. But I had to know. Had it all been real? Or was I losing my mind? I stepped into the hallway. It was darker than I remembered. The walls were coated in shadows, like fingers reaching out from the corners. I glanced over my shoulder. No one was behind me, but the feeling of being watched, observed, made my skin crawl. The whisper came again. This time, it was unmistakable. "Come closer." My pulse quickened. I didn't want to, but my body moved against my will. I inched forward, my feet dragging like I was being pulled by an invisible force. The hallway stretched out before me, longer than it should have been, the lights overhead flickering sporadically. At the far end of the hallway, I saw something. A shape. It was standing there, waiting. A figure. I couldn't make out details, just a shadow, like the ones from the library. It felt like it was growing, expanding, becoming something more. "Are you ready to join this story?" the voice asked, its tone mocking. I shook my head. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had escaped it, hadn't I? But the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. And then I understood. I hadn't escaped. I had only made it back to the beginning. The hallway was no longer an ordinary space. The walls bent and warped like they were made of living darkness. It wasn't a place I could escape. This was a prison, just like the library. Just like the book. And I was still part of the story. I had never left. I turned, ready to run, but as I did, the hallway seemed to stretch even further. The door at the end, my exit, the one I thought I could reach, was gone. The walls pressed in, like they were closing around me. There was no escape. The whispers came again, now a chorus of voices. You belong here now. Forever. I reached for the walls, clawing at them, trying to force my way through, but they shifted and morphed like liquid, slipping through my fingers. The shadow, the figure, was coming closer, its shape growing more defined, more solid. It didn't have a face, but it didn't need one. I could feel its eyes on me. I was trapped. The last of the light in the hallway flickered and died, plunging me into an all-encompassing darkness. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the book calling my name, and the figure's presence pressed down on me like an unbearable weight. And then, the darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness didn't fade, didn't shift. It felt like it was swallowing every part of me, each second that passed an eternity. There was no sensation of time. No sound. No light. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the presence, the thing that had been with me since the very beginning. The figure. The book. The endless library of shadows. I could hear it now, the voice from the book, whispering in my ear, soothing and cold. You've come to the end. But there is no end here. Not for you. The last thing I remembered was the sound of pages turning. The whisper of the book. And then, nothing. I woke up, or at least, I thought I did. The sensation of floating in a vast, infinite space lingered around me. There was no floor, no walls, no ceiling, just endless, suffocating darkness. My body felt weightless, disconnected, as if I were suspended in the void, my senses consumed by the nothingness. It was like being caught between two worlds, neither here nor there. I couldn't remember how much time had passed, nor could I tell if it was even possible to measure it. The minutes, if they existed, melted away like water slipping through the cracks of my consciousness. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Was this what it felt like to be lost in the book? To be trapped within the very story that had ensnared me? Or was this something worse, something more real than anything I had ever known? Is this what you wanted? The voice from the book murmured again, faint and distant, like it was right beside me, but not quite there. You can never leave. This is your place now. I couldn't answer. There was nothing to say. Nothing left to fight. I didn't even know what I was fighting anymore. The boundaries between reality and whatever this was had blurred into a fog so thick I couldn't see through it. My thoughts felt like echoes, too far removed from any semblance of clarity. And then, as if someone or something had heard my desperate confusion, a new presence entered the void. It wasn't a figure this time. It wasn't the shadow. No, this was something more pervasive, more invasive. I could feel it, pressing in from every direction, closing in on me like a wave that could not be stopped. The darkness began to shift, to pulsate, and suddenly, I was no longer alone in this place. I saw the shapes emerging from the shadows. Faces, twisted and contorted into grotesque expressions, faces I recognized, my face, and the faces of people I had never seen, all blending together like reflections in shattered glass. They reached for me, their hands stretching forward. I recoiled instinctively, but they didn't touch me. They couldn't. Their fingers seemed to pass right through me, dissolving in the air, like they were made of the same intangible material that surrounded me. The voice laughed. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" it taunted, growing louder now, becoming almost unbearable in its volume. "This is your eternity. Your fate." I squeezed my eyes shut, the intensity of the sound making it almost impossible to think clearly. The voices swirled around me, joining in chorus, their words intertwining into an indecipherable hum, like 100 conversations happening at once, all asking the same question. "Why are you here?" I didn't know how to answer. The question was simple, but it held a weight I could not bear. I had wanted to know what was behind the book, what lay beyond the pages of the story. But now, standing, or floating, I should say, in this place, it didn't matter anymore. It was too late for answers. Too late for escape. And then, as if the room, the void itself, decided I needed one last moment of clarity, I saw it. In the midst of the chaos, amidst the endless shifting faces and whispers, I saw a small, faint light. A pinprick of illumination, so weak I could barely believe it existed in this overwhelming blackness. I wasn't sure what it was at first. It was too far away. But the moment I fixed my eyes on it, I felt something stir within me, a pull. An urge to go toward it. To reach for it. I began moving, slowly at first, as though my very existence was fighting me every step of the way. The air was thick. Each step felt like a battle. But I had to get there. I had to know what it was. What it meant. The light grew brighter the closer I got. It wasn't just light, it was warmth, too. A heat that pierced through the cold emptiness, a flicker of something that felt almost like hope. I reached out, my hand trembling, fingers stretching toward it. And as I touched the light, everything stopped. The darkness shattered. The faces and whispers faded away, leaving nothing but silence. And in that silence, I felt it, a sense of completion. A finality, both painful and liberating, like the end of something that had never truly begun. I was still there, in the void, but it didn't matter anymore. I understood now. The story wasn't about escape. It was about knowing when to stop fighting. I had found the end. The story had come full circle. And there, in the unbroken silence, I finally understood what the book had been trying to tell me all along. Have you ever wondered what lurks in places you're not meant to see? The spaces that are locked away, the ones you're told never to enter? What happens when the forbidden whispers its secrets to you and curiosity pushes you past the lines of caution? I had always lived in the same building. A cramped apartment on the top floor of a tall, gray structure that loomed like a shadow over the street below. The neighbors were strangers. The hallways always smelled of old wood and stale air. The kind of place that seemed alive with secrets, its walls holding stories no one spoke aloud. But there was one thing about this building that never made sense to me. Every night, at exactly midnight, the basement light would flicker on. Now, I'm not talking about the usual flicker you get from faulty wiring. This was different. The light would come on every single night, without fail, and it would stay on for hours, long after everyone else had gone to bed. The basement was off limits. The door was locked, and no one was allowed to go down there, ever. It had been like that since I moved in, no explanations, no warnings. Just a note on the building's notice board saying, basement access prohibited. But every night, there it was. That flickering light. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was just imagining it. Maybe it was some sort of malfunction. Or perhaps I was hearing things in my half-awake state. But then I started noticing the pattern. Every night, at exactly midnight, the light flicked on. Every time. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The curiosity gnawed at me, relentless and sharp. I told myself it was just the building's wiring, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew better. Something didn't sit right. I had to know. I crept quietly down the stairs, making sure not to wake anyone in the building. The air around me felt thick, as if the walls were closing in. The faint hum of the fluorescent bulb above me seemed too loud, almost too purposeful. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the basement door. The door was locked, as always. But tonight, something was different. The faint outline of light seeped through the cracks beneath the door. It wasn't much, but it was enough to know the light was on in there, just like every other night. I hesitated for a moment. The warning of the building manager echoed in my mind, no one is allowed in the basement. But that feeling, the one that always tells you that something is wrong, pushed me forward. I tried the handle. Surprisingly, it turned. I had expected it to be locked, but instead, the door creaked open with a groan. I paused. Should I turn back? Was this foolish? Maybe I was about to uncover something that I wasn't meant to. But the pull of curiosity was too strong. I stepped into the darkness. The light above flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the floor. The basement was nothing like I had imagined. It was small, cluttered with boxes and old furniture, things that seemed forgotten. But there, in the center of the room, was a strange glow. The light source didn't seem to come from the single overhead bulb. No, this light was coming from somewhere else, something deeper, hidden within the clutter. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the room. The light, it was coming from the wall. And that's when I saw it. Faint, pale fingerprints smudged across the concrete as if something, had been touching the wall for a long time. The marks were fresh, glistening under the weak light, and they led directly to a section of the wall that seemed out of place. The texture was different here, rougher. Like it wasn't meant to be part of the rest of the basement. I reached out to touch it, but just as my fingers brushed the surface, the light above flickered violently. A loud buzzing sound filled the air, and the temperature in the room dropped. A sharp, biting cold I hadn't noticed before. My breath came out in clouds. The lights flickered again, longer this time, before going out completely. I was left standing in darkness, the sound of my own heartbeat loud in my ears. I wanted to leave. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but the sensation of something behind me, something watching, kept me rooted to the spot. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, like a breath against my ear. Why are you here? I froze. The voice was not my own. It came from the direction of the wall, and I could hear something shifting there, scraping against the concrete. Something moved, a slow, deliberate drag, like a hand reaching for me. I swallowed hard. My pulse quickened. I needed to get out. But as I turned to leave, I heard a low creak. The door, the one I had just come through, was slowly closing on its own. The lock clicked shut. I rushed to the door, panic surging through my veins. My fingers fumbled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The metal was cold beneath my touch, like the door itself had turned to ice. I yanked again, harder this time, but it was no use. It was as though something on the other side was holding it closed. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I backed away from the door. The sound of my heartbeat seemed deafening in the silence, but the whispering continued. Low, unintelligible words drifting through the air. It wasn't just one voice anymore, there were more, like a chorus of murmurs, each one blending into the next, growing louder as if they were closing in around me. I couldn't see anything in the dark. The room was suffocating, filled with shadows that twisted and moved. And then, I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like nails on stone, coming from the corner of the room. I forced myself to move. Step by step, I edged toward the corner, where the sound seemed to be coming from. My hands trembled, and I felt nauseous from the cold, from the oppressive air that clung to me. The wall was closer now, and I could see the faint outline of the fingerprints, smeared and streaked in the darkness, leading up to a crack in the wall. Without thinking, I reached out and touched the crack. It felt wrong. There was no give to it, no sign that it was simply a part of the building. Something was behind it. Something waiting. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the basement, and I staggered back in fear. The lights above flickered again, casting a dim glow that barely lit the space. I could see it now, an outline emerging from the shadows. A shape. A figure. It was just barely visible, but I could make out the outline of a person standing perfectly still in the corner, watching me. My throat tightened and my body froze. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. It was as if it had always been there, hidden in the depths of the basement, waiting for me to come down, waiting for me to discover it. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became screams, distorted and guttural, as if coming from the depths of the earth itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was look at that figure, feeling its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone. Vanished. The room felt emptier, colder. The scratching stopped. The whispers ceased. I ran back to the door, desperately pulling at the handle again. This time, it opened. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, my heart racing. The basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I stood there for a moment, panting, trying to collect my thoughts. What had just happened? What was in that basement? The building felt different now, as though it had changed, like I had crossed some invisible line I wasn't meant to cross. But there was something more, something I hadn't noticed before. The light, the one I had seen flickering in the basement every night, was still on. The glow was visible through the small window at the top of the basement door. But it wasn't just a flicker now. It was constant, unwavering. And the light, it seemed to pulse, as if breathing, as if alive. I took a deep breath and backed away. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain, I was never going back down there. The basement had become something else. It had changed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out why. But as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that had followed me out of the darkness, something that had been waiting in the shadows of the basement for far too long. I hurried back to my apartment, feeling an overwhelming sense of urgency pushing me forward, but every step felt like it was dragging me deeper into a nightmare. My legs were weak, my head spinning, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The sense of dread that had taken over me in that basement hadn't faded. It clung to me, suffocating me with each passing moment. As I reached my door, I quickly unlocked it and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I leaned against the door for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The room around me was still. Everything appeared normal, just as it always had been. But it didn't feel that way anymore. I went over what had just happened in my mind. The whispers. The figure. The light. It was all too real, too vivid. It was as though I had uncovered something hidden, something ancient and waiting. But why me? Why now? Suddenly, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my stomach dropped. A soft thud echoed from the hallway outside my apartment door. My breath caught in my throat. No. The noise came again, louder this time, one steady, slow thump, followed by another. I couldn't move. My body froze, and I strained to hear, to make sense of the sound. It was coming closer. Closer to my door. My heart raced. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, I couldn't let it in. I needed to be quiet, to be still. But the thumping continued, drawing nearer, like someone or something was walking down the hallway. I felt my pulse quicken. The door, the one I had just closed with such finality, seemed to grow smaller in my eyes. I could almost hear the air pressing against it, as if something invisible was pushing on the other side, trying to get in. Trying to break through. And then, the thumping stopped. For a long, unbearable moment, there was nothing. Silence. It was as though the world had gone still. My breath caught in my chest. I strained to hear anything, to catch even the faintest sound, but there was nothing. No movement. No whispers. Nothing. I slowly let out a breath, but before I could even relax, the lights flickered, casting the room into a dim, erratic glow. The temperature in the apartment dropped, and I could see my breath forming in front of me. A chill settled over my skin, creeping beneath my clothes. And then, a knock. Soft at first, almost gentle, but then louder. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed in the silence, reverberating through my bones. The knocking came from the door. From the other side. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, to run, to hide, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't breathe. The knocking continued, each sound reverberating through my skull. I staggered backward, stumbling over my own feet, my heart pounding violently. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't help it. My hand moved toward the knob, and despite every fiber of my being screaming to stop, I twisted it. Slowly. Reluctantly. The door creaked open, but there was no one there. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the empty hallway. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt suffocating, unnatural. There was nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty corridor stretching out before me. I glanced down at the floor. Footprints. Bare, wet footprints leading from the hallway into my apartment. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen those prints before. In the basement. I slowly backed away from the door, shutting it behind me with shaking hands. My mind was racing, thoughts colliding in panic and confusion. What was happening? What had I uncovered? Why were these things happening to me? The footprints weren't the only thing that had changed. I could feel it. Something was different about my apartment. The air was heavier now, thick with a presence I couldn't understand. Something was inside of me. I turned to face the dimly lit room. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. They twisted, as if alive, slowly creeping across the floor and walls. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. A faint whisper. One word. A name. Welcome. And just like that, the lights went out. The darkness closed in on me, suffocating me in its embrace. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, drowning out every rational thought. I wasn't alone anymore. The basement had never truly let me go. The darkness was overwhelming. It felt like it had weight, pressing against me from all sides, making it harder to breathe. I could hear the whispers, not just from one direction, but from everywhere, filling the room. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the light switch, but it was no use. The darkness clung to me like a living thing, pushing me further into panic. Welcome. The word repeated over and over again, echoing in my mind, growing louder, more insistent. My eyes darted around the room, trying to make out any shape, any movement, but it was impossible. Everything was cloaked in blackness. The air felt thick with something ancient, something that had been here long before I had arrived. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against my arm. My body jerked, and I let out a strangled gasp. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, like ice crawling over my skin. I spun around, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I had no way out. Then, a voice. Not a whisper this time, but clear and unmistakable. You should have left the basement alone. It was as if the words had come from everywhere, filling the room with a deep, guttural tone that made my stomach twist in fear. I staggered back, my mind reeling. I had to get out. I had to leave. But my legs wouldn't move. They felt frozen, locked in place. The temperature dropped even more. I could feel the ice-cold air around me, and I realized with a sudden surge of horror that my breath was coming out in misty clouds. It was as if the world around me had become something unnatural, twisted by forces beyond comprehension. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls inched closer, the shadows growing, bending, moving. I could hear them now, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from all sides, from beneath the floor, above the ceiling. They were all around me, just out of sight, but I knew they were there. They were coming closer. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, choked by the heaviness of the air. And then, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowed, emerged from the corner of the room. It was a silhouette, no features visible, just a dark shape against the blackness, but I could feel it watching me, studying me. My legs finally found movement, and I backed away, pressing myself into the corner as if trying to disappear into the walls. You're not leaving. The voice was louder now, clearer, and it was filled with a terrible finality. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel it in my throat. Panic surged through me, but there was no escape. The figure stepped forward, and I could hear the soft scrape of its feet against the floor. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance. Weak at first, but then brighter, cutting through the darkness. It was the light from the basement. The same light that had drawn me here in the first place. But now, I knew it wasn't just a light. It was a doorway. A portal. A threshold I had crossed into something I could never escape. The figure raised a hand, a long, shadowed limb, and pointed toward the light. Its voice was low, almost a growl. "It's already too late." And then the room erupted in darkness again. The light vanished, and I was left alone in the black, with nothing but the deafening silence around me. But it wasn't silent for long. I could hear the footsteps again. Closer now. The whispers, too, were returning, louder than ever, filling the room, suffocating me. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, chanting something I couldn't understand. The figure was there, moving through the shadows, its presence pressing against me. I couldn't escape. I knew it now. And then the voices stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was pregnant with something unspoken, something waiting. My mind raced, my heart hammered in my chest, and I realized with an awful certainty, there was no way out. Not anymore. The light in the basement was the last glimpse of what was once real. The basement was never just a place. It was a gateway. A doorway that had been waiting for someone to open it. And now it had claimed me. And I was never coming back. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.